Hello everyone, welcome to a painting tutorial by Static Grass Creations. My name is Jason and today I'll be showing you how I painted this Lord Arcanum on Gryph-Charger. This model is from the Stormcast Eternals faction in the Soul Wars box. I picked the Hallowed Knights color scheme and customized the helmet. I've also added some old Empire bits to the model. I have already primed the model black and added some white primer to help me with the brightness and shadows. I start with painting all of the fabric areas with Vallejo Deep Sky Blue. Then, the feathers of the Gryph-Charger are painted with Celestra Grey and then highlighted with white. It won't totally be white because the paint is quite thin, but I want to pick out the highlights and shadows at this stage, which I will be coming back to later. I highlight the blue with Macragge Blue. I make sure the deeper recesses of the fabric are left with the dark blue, and the fabric should have some depth to it as it takes the highlights. I'm using several thin coats for a smoother transition. Lothern Blue is added to make about a 1-to-1 mix with Macragge Blue for a second highlight. This is painted on in the same manner of the previous highlight, but a bit more focused on the raised areas. The edges will be start of the highlight as I blend the rest for a smooth transition. With this kind of highlight, I want to make sure that I have a good foundation for the final highlight that's coming up. For me, this means that it will make it easier for me to make smooth transitions between this highlight and the final highlight. The final highlight is pure Lothern Blue. For the most part, I just highlight the edges. If the surface is more rounded, I blend the final highlight around the middle or the nearest edge for a smooth transition. I want to make sure that I am taking advantage of the work that I put in for the darker highlight. This means that I can keep the pure Lothern Blue highlight tight and focused on the edges and the most raised parts of the cloth. I don't have to blend or highlight too far out, it's already highlighted for me. I start on the metals with brushing on Stynylrez Metal on all the parts I want silver. This is very bright but provides good coverage since it's a primer. Retributor Armour is painted on the gold areas. This paint provides very good coverage and is the best gold I've used to date. I've decided all the trim and iconography will be done in gold. I recently picked up some contrast paint and I'll be using Ultramarines Blue on all the silver parts. It's a fairly thick coat, but it ends up too dark and blue, so I'll be bringing it back up to silver later. The gold is washed in Reikland Fleshshade for its first shade. The red tint from the wash will promote the contrast between the blue all over the rest of the model and will help the embellishments pop. I use Vallejo Chrome to go over all the metals. I want to bring back the silver areas from the dark blue, however, I make sure to leave the cracks blue or keep a part of the layer translucent so the blue shows through. I'm trying to make the silver colder in tone rather than having blue metal. The gold will take the chrome as a highlight as well. For the most part, I am edge highlighting the gold rather than layering on this highlight. I want to keep the gold details sharp and very much golden color. I was not happy with the blue tint on the mount's barding, though I think the Lord Arcanum's armor is fine. I thinned down Vallejo Deep Sky Blue and focused on the concave part of the front barding and the inset part of the scales. This blue has a different tone than the contrast blue, so it helps separate the mount from the rider. Once again, I use Vallejo Chrome to bring the silver back up in brightness. I'm more careful this time and keep more of the blue showing. Next, I paint all the straps, belts, scabbard, and saddle in Rhinox Hide. This is my standard way of doing leathers. Rhinox Hide has a red tint to it and is nice and dark. Though I prefer my leathers to end up as a light brown, a medium brown or dark brown is definitely considered. In addition, I shade the gold further by blending some brown on the opposite edges to the chrome. In the case of concave surfaces, I paint brown touching the chrome highlight to maximize the contrast and give a better feeling of depth. I paint Celestra Grey on the tabard, the clothing underneath the armor, and the hair. I like using this gray as a starting point for white or off-white, that I want to have a colder tone for. This is particularly helpful because white paint or close to white paint tends to be difficult to have decent coverage from. Next, I highlight the grey with Vallejo Ivory. Much like the blue, I am focusing on the raised parts of the cloth. It will be getting brighter, so the highlight layer does cover most of the area. I am making sure my highlighting and blending are smooth, so the cloth looks soft. This means I limit my hard lines when highlighting. Even when I'm painting the edges and points, I'm also blending some of it out so very little of the highlight will actually be an opaque layer. Vallejo Off-White is used to further highlight the cloth and the Gryph-Charger itself. The Celestra Grey really helps the off-white coverage and keep the highlight on the cloth closer to the edges and raised areas. The grips of the sword and staff are painted with P3 Sanguine Base, followed by a highlight of Wazdakka Red, and then a final edge highlight of Vallejo Flat Red. I feel the last highlight gives it a nice saturated look to the red. The Hallowed Knights scheme calls for a more maroon color for these details, but I wanted to reference how this kind of red is what I use in my human Middenheim army. Jumping back to the leathers, I apply Mournfang Brown as a fairly thick layer, leaving only the deepest recesses dark brown. The red tinge from this paint contrasts with the blue, and since a lot of it's in the center of the model, it will help break up the otherwise large swath of blue and cold tones across the rest of the model. I quickly paint the vials on the side of the saddle in off-white. Now that the leathers have dried, I paint a final highlight of Vallejo Golden Brown. This is not as focused as the final highlight of the fabrics. I wanted the brown to feel a bit softer, so this highlight is more of a layer and not as much of a difference in brightness compared to the fabrics. Starting on the embellishments, I paint all the parchments with Army Painter's Necrotic Flesh. I then wash the parchments with Agrax Earthshade. I let the wash pool in the recesses and avoid the raised areas. While waiting for the wash to dry, I paint the gems. There's a couple on each side of the barding, though one is covered by parchment on my model, one on the front of the barding, and one on the Lord Arcanum's head. Once the wash has dried, I highlight the parchments with Ushabti Bone. This will cover most of the parchments so that they end up quite bright. I'm not as careful with the highlighting and blending here as I was with the cloth. I still avoid the cracks, but I do go over some of the recessed areas. Since the paint is a bit translucent, it ends up looking worn or old. The final highlight of off-white is applied. I'm doing a fair bit of blending and making sure the highlight is soft like paper. This time, I'm not going over the recessed areas like the last highlight. There is more of a focus on the raised sections of the parchment, making the overall tone quite pale or even sun-bleached. Deep Sky Blue and Lothern Blue are mixed to make a highlight for the gems. This highlight is only applied to the sharp edges of the gem, all the way across the length and width. Pure Lothern Blue further highlights the gems. This time I pull back about 3/4 of the way on each side so that the light is focused on the center of the gem. Lastly, each gem gets a final highlight of off-white. I focus on the center of each gem, only extending the white out about quarter to halfway from the center. Then a single dot is added to one of the sides for each of the gems for the sparkle. Now, onto the mount. I'm adding more white to really brighten the feathers. This ends up being about 3 to 4 more layers to get the brightness that I'm happy with. I'm putting the highlight on all of the areas facing the top of the model or the general area where its source of light should be. The beak gets a base of Tau Light Ochre. I don't want to mess up my painstakingly done white feathers, so I'm quite careful with this coat. I use Averland Sunset to highlight the beak. Naturally, the bumps along the side of the beak and the tip will get a highlight. Using Vallejo Black, I paint all the horns, claws, chitin on top of the claws, hooves, and tips of the feathers on the legs and the tips of the tails. The feather tips are roughly in the shape of a V, somewhat like how feathers are naturally shaped. Ivory is used as the last highlight to the yellow on the beak. The beige will help desaturate the yellow and make it a bit more uniform with the rest of the Gryph-Charger. Now to work on the pattern for the mount. Using black, I start with the tip of the beak by painting an upside down T down the center. I also fill in the nostrils and eyes. The pattern is inspired by the black and white warbler, a tiny and cute bird that happens to look awesome. The pattern on the head has a black line going towards the eyes. I'm actually painting in vertical strokes to imitate a more natural pattern. I don't want perfectly straight lines here. The lines on top of the head are substantially thicker, and I'm painting side to side here, ordered yet not neat, getting thicker as it gets closer to the horn. The chest pattern has black lines ending in points towards the head. Again, painting side to side, I start at the base of the cone near the torso and work my way up to a point as I get just under the reins. I have the pattern continue down the legs as well. They are not as thick as the patterns on the neck, but they still end in points. This time, I end the cones just past the knees. Lastly, there's a final strip down the tail. Tau Light Ochre is watered down and applied to the claws and hooves. I don't go very far up the limbs, and the paint is thin enough so it's like a wash. The white keeps the yellow bright and pools in the crevices. I then highlight the yellow with off-white. Like the beak, I find the yellow a bit saturated for what I want, so I want it a bit paler so it's closer to the white. I then highlight the patterns and other black areas with Mechanicus Standard Gray. This is the first highlight, so I'm applying it quite liberally. I'm not too concerned with making sure it faces the top of the miniature. Some barbs on the feathers are picked out, but I'm not being careful yet. The claws and horns are highlighted facing the top of the model. I think they're small enough surfaces and could use a more stark contrast for the texture I'm going for. Similarly to the feathers, the tail tips are highlighted with little concern for the source of light. Aggressor Gray is used as the final highlight on the Grey. This will be the sharpest and focused highlight for the Grey, just like the final highlight for any of the other colors. The claws and chitin get a sharper and cleaner highlight to make the edges pop, to make them feel like they are a hard surface. More individual feathers and barbs are picked out cleanly. I try to limit the sharp highlights on the patterns, so it ends up feeling a bit softer in texture. I used Warp Lightning Contrast on the two vials on the saddle. This needed a second coat to push it that much darker. I wanted them to feel like containers with a magical liquid. The hair gets a thick coat of Akhelian Green. This is only the base coat because I want it a bit brighter later. While I'm waiting for the hair to dry, I highlight the vials with off-white. Since the contrast paint pools in the depressed areas, it leaves the higher edges a bit brighter. I'm looking to make it seem like the vials are made out of glass with this immediate jump to off-white. I'm focusing on the points where the vials stick out or the edges I want to pick out help define the shape. Now that the hair is dry, I mix white and Akhelian Green as the first highlight. Aside from the most hidden or bottom strands, the highlight is pretty comprehensive. Adding more white to the mix, I apply a more discerning highlight to the hair. It would be for the side of the hair facing the top of the model and are on the rise of the curve. Only a few strands are highlighted on the bottom of the curve. Pure white is used as the final highlight to the hair. I'm only picking out the tips of the hair in certain strands. This will be similar to the magical glowing I will be painting on the staff, which is what I start on now. The visor on the helmet and the front and back of the top of the staff get a coat of Lothern Blue. I don't paint the very tips of lightning on the staff with blue, as I want to limit the range of the glow effect. White is added to Lothern Blue for the first highlight layer. I'm not picking out particular edges, I'm painting the same area though a bit closer to the source of the glow. Some pure Lothern Blue should still be showing on the edges of the effect. More white is added to the mix and is applied to more of the source of the glow and its immediate surrounding edges. Like for other highlights that are facing towards the top of the model, the glow is the source of these highlights. Any edges and surfaces facing the glow will take the highlight. The visor is the source on the helmet, so this highlight is applied inside the eye slit with a bit spilling out. To finish off the glow, I highlight the center of the glow with white. Since the paint is quite thin, this will take a few layers to get the brightness I want. I make sure to keep going over the very center of the source for the glowing so it looks like the blue is bursting out. Now for the glow from the vials. I start with Warpstone Glow in the surrounding areas and some on the greaves. I'm trying to make it look like the green is coming from the vials and reflecting. Next, I use Warboss Green. Like the blue glow, this is the second highlight and is more focused. I still make sure that the first coat of green still shows through around the rim of the glow. Moot Green is used to brighten the glow. I'm putting most of the coat closer to the vials. I also paint hard lines on the greaves, reinforcing its metallic feel. The next highlight is Cygnus Yellow. It's more focused around the vials and the hard highlight on the greaves. The final highlight is white. It's focused on the immediate area around the vials and the points on the greaves closer to the source. I'm avoiding adding any of these highlights to the vials themselves so they can be some sort of dark substance emanating light. I decided the glow is a bit too bright. I think it draws too much attention to where it is, so Biel Tan Green is used to tone down the green glow. At this point, I'm now working on the base. I apply a couple of coats of Rakarth Flesh to the stone tile part of the base. Bloodstone is used to paint the dented surface. It's a thinner paint, so I use a couple coats. A heavy wash of Agrax Earthshade is applied to the stones on the stump, and make sure the cracks get a thick coat. Once the brown wash is dry, I apply a lighter wash of Nuln Oil. Overall, I want the tiles a bit darker. To add some variety to the tiles, I pick out random ones in Biel Tan Green or Drakenof Nightshade washes. I'm only picking irregular tiles behind the dividing strip in the middle of the base. They will end up as hints of colors. Ushabti du Bone is dry brushed onto the tiles. The blue and green from the random tiles should still be obvious. I'm looking to form the shape of each tile by getting the edges and leaving the cracks dark. Off-white is then dry brushed as the final highlight. This helps make the tiles seem like they're weathered and dusty and old. I am also applying the dry brush to the claws to make it seem like the mount is tracking the stone dust as well, putting the whole model in the scene. I then paint the strips along the dividing line with Ultramarines Blue contrast paint, a fairly thick coat that will be a great contrast to the warm stone color and red-brown surface. This is then highlighted with a mix of Ultramarines Blue contrast and Lothern Blue. I use Lothern Blue as a final highlight to the strips. Deathclaw Brown is used to highlight the dented surface. Though the coat is applied generously, I'm careful to avoid the indentations across the area. I want them to stick out. The final part of the base to paint is the lip. Here, I use Vallejo German Camo Medium Brown. Lastly, for the base, I'm going to add the greenery. In this case, autumn greenery. The leaves are attached by superglue. I add a bunch all over quite randomly, and once I'm happy with the placement of the leaves and the amount, I spread on some PVA glue in patches and sprinkle on some green flock. I'm going for a mossy and unkempt look to the base. The last part of the model I'll be doing is the scripting on the parchments, by using a very small brush and black. For the writing, I'm making uneven lines and vertical strokes, sometimes stippling too. For the wide sheet, I paint a small wolf motif. The paint is kept thin so the coat will be smooth. And that finishes the model. The old Middenheim color scheme is blue and white, and my old Teuton Guard are painted in silver armor with gold accents as well. It was a happy coincidence that the Stormcast Eternals happened to have a sub-faction that pretty much followed my theme exactly. This hero is going to be a great addition to a small burgeoning Stormcast force, although they will probably only ever be support troops in my Cities of Sigmar army. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial from Stynylrez Creations. Stay tuned for more videos. Don't forget to like and subscribe.